Our plan had been to have a three-person panel discussion, myself with two of the co-authors of the Rich States, Poor States report from the American Legislative Exchange Council with Jonathan Williams and Steve Moore. Unfortunately, Steve Moore has been called into a meeting at the White House, so we're going to excuse him just this once. So let me introduce my good friend Jonathan Williams. Jonathan is the president and chief economist of the American Legislative Exchange Council, where he works with state policymakers, congressional leaders, and members of the private sector to develop fiscal policy solutions for the states. Williams founded the ALEC Center for State Fiscal Reform in 2011 and co-authors Rich States, Poor States, the ALEC Laffer Economic State Competitiveness Index with Reagan economist Dr. Arthur Laffer and Stephen Moore. Prior to joining ALEC, Williams served as staff economist at the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, authoring numerous tax policy studies. His work has appeared in many publications. He is a contributor for The Hill and a columnist at Tax Analysts, the leading provider of tax news and analysis for the global community. Williams also serves on the advisory board of the State Financial Officers Foundation and as an adjunct fellow at the Kansas Policy Institute. He has written for the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. In addition, Williams was a contributing author of In Defense of Capitalism. Williams has spoken to audiences across all 50 states and provided testimony for the U.S. Congress as well as numerous state legislative bodies. His work has been featured at the federal level by the White House, the Congressional Joint Economic Committee, and the U.S. House Committee on Ways and Means. Please welcome my friend, Jonathan Williams.
Well, thank you, Dave, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back at PLC here once again. I am excited to be here. I always like to say greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C., where we are based. As the great Ronald Reagan would say, Washington is an island surrounded by reality. So having a chance to get off of the island and back into reality back at PLC is a good thing. And Loman, thank you for the invitation. You can catch my commentaries on Loman's American Radio Journal Network every third week to talk about what's going on across the states. And that's what I wanted to focus on today. Many of you may be familiar with ALEC. We've been around for more than 50 years now as an organization. And if you like free markets, if you like individual liberty, if you like basically the federal government not making all the decisions for us, and unless to allow states and local governments and ultimately the people through federalism to make decisions, you're going to love ALEC. And if you don't like those things, you're probably not going to like ALEC. But I think this crowd is probably a safe space. What I wanted to talk about today, and I usually, now over the last 20 years working with Steve Moore and Art Laffer on this Rich States, Poor States project, we've got a lot of different examples that we've come up with. If we've traveled across the country multiple times over. In fact, I have joked that I've been to all of President Obama's 57 states a couple of times over the course of the last few years with this project. And, you know, one of the things that I want to do is help Pennsylvania do well. And the great thing about federalism is states get to decide their own course for the future. And that's the beauty of the American experiment, right? We don't have a one-size-fits-all government. The founders were very clear about that. In fact, my team from ALEC right here, we're doing a lot of great work right now thinking about how do we properly commemorate America's 250th birthday coming up, just in a little over a year. And what is so unique about the American experiment? One of the great things about the American experiment is the founders. And who here, you don't have to raise your hand and admit that you haven't, because I hadn't recently either, but who's read the Declaration of Independence recently? I encourage you, if you have not, it's a little bit of homework this weekend. It's a short read, but it's an incredibly impactful read. And when you read it, you remind yourself what the founders were so worried about. It was, of course, they were so worried about protecting the individual and protecting individual liberty, and they were worried about a strong central government. And of course, then it was a single individual, the King of England, to protect against central government overreach. And that is why, as President Reagan reminds us, it was not the federal government that created the states. It was the states that created the federal government. Let's never forget that. And that's one thing we always have to remind ourselves in. And so when we think about when states do get to make these decisions for themselves, as the Bible says, you can choose life or death, a blessing or a curse. And at the state level, you can boil it down to the economics of it. You can be more like Texas and Florida and less like California, Illinois, and New York. And how do we get there for Pennsylvania? Who here is happy where you're at right now under Governor Shapiro and economic competitiveness? Okay, not a single hand. I didn't think I would find any finders on that question right there. So let me, in a few minutes here, before we get into a question with my Q&A with my good friend Dave Taylor, unpack what we're seeing across the country. To get it right when it comes to fixing Pennsylvania, getting taxes down so you compete with states like Ohio and West Virginia and states all across the country, you first have to get it right on the spending side of the equation, because spending has gone up like most states, in many cases, the states like Pennsylvania, the states that have not been governed by fiscal conservatives in recent years, have spent money like drunken sailors. Right? There is no reason right now that the governor wants to tap into the rainy day fund after blowing through billions and billions of dollars of surplus money here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So anybody excited about what Elon Musk is doing right now in Washington, D.C.? All right, we got a few Elon Musk fans around here. And by the way, the vitriol that he is taking right now with the Tesla dealerships being, bombed and set on fire, and the threats of what's going on across the country is absolutely unbelievable. For his sin of simply trying to correct a $36 trillion national debt problem. That is his sin out there, right? But what we are seeing at the state level right now is exactly the need to do the same thing. And that is going to be the key for Pennsylvania to turn things around long term. And what we have developed is these are the dangerous questions that we need to be asking our policymakers in Pennsylvania and states all across the country. And they need to be asking the folks that are spending the money in the agencies and the governor. And what is the role of government? What are the essential services government must fulfill to provide it for its purpose? How do we know if government's doing a good job? And that's a big one. I'm sure we have a few small business owners in the audience. How long would you make it as a small business if you couldn't answer questions like these? But oftentimes these are questions that don't get asked, certainly at the federal level, but even at the state and local levels of government. Now, one thing I wanted to just show up as an illustration, one of the things that we at ALEC have come together with a great piece of model policy from Colorado, of all places, is the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, where in their Constitution in Colorado 30 years ago, they said government can grow, it just can't grow faster than individuals' pocketbooks, essentially, or the economy. Can't grow faster than population and inflation. So what I did on this screen right here is show what if Colorado and Pennsylvania adopted it in the same year in 1992, and what would spending in Pennsylvania look like if it had just slowed spending to this growth of the economy as Colorado did 30 plus years ago. And what does that mean? You can see the golf there on the two lines, but what does that mean for every individual? It means that every individual, man, woman, and child in the state of Pennsylvania would have saved nearly $30,000 in savings because of Pennsylvania strictly limiting spending to basically common sense. What does that equate to? It's $944 per year per person over that period. I don't know about you. If you've looked at your 401k the last couple of days, I could use an extra $944 to help make up the difference. That is the benefit of getting spending under control. And of course, that will mean that you can get taxes under control longer term. And in the last year, I've probably been in about 35 states. This has been an incredible moment of time where states are utilizing this idea that they can be the laboratories of democracy, and they're not waiting. Obviously, President Trump's got a great plan ahead to renew the Trump tax cuts. That goes away by the end of this year if nothing is done. But the states are not waiting for that to happen. They are moving ahead. And one of the messages that I think is so key for the future of Pennsylvania, for all of you that care about the economy and care about your pocketbook issues here, is Pennsylvania will fall behind if you stand still. Absolutely, period. Because in the last 4 years, we have seen now half of the states substantially cut taxes on small businesses and individuals across the board because they realize that is the ticket to success at the state level. Nobody wants to be the next Illinois. Nobody wants to be the next New Jersey. They want to be the growth states like Tennessee and Texas and Florida and the states that are getting it right. And here's the list of states that have been cutting taxes over the last several years. The other thing I will say is one of the key pieces of our research over the last 20 years now in rich states, poor states, is this is not just economic theory, folks. This is Americans voting with their feet every single year and leaving high tax states and going to states that value economic freedom and keep taxes low. And this is not just states making tiny cuts of income tax rates. If anybody's seen it in the news, did you all see what happened in Mississippi last week? Mississippi became a flat tax state a couple of years ago, and that was a great thing. But what they did just in the last week is Mississippi became a state that has repealed now its personal income tax altogether. They have eliminated their income tax, ladies and gentlemen, in Mississippi. That would be, once the phase-in happens, the first state in over 40 years to do so. And it will not be the last, because this race for American capital, this race for taxpayers is intensifying. And these numbers on the slide right now, these are 12 months of data points. This is not population. This isn't birth rates and death rates. It's not even international immigration. This is simply Americans voting with their feet and going from one state to another over a 12-month period. So on net, Texas has gained over 85,000 new residents over that 12-month period. North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Tennessee. You notice something those states have in common? Lower taxes than Pennsylvania, better regulatory climate than Pennsylvania, no state death tax like Pennsylvania has, all those things that matter for why people leave and go to another state. Now you look at the other side of the equation, probably no surprises here, but look at the devastating outmigration that in one 12-month period, California, the formerly golden state, of now 239,000 Americans leaving California on net in 12 months to go to one of the other 49 states. Think about that for a second. As Gavin Newsom was going across the country in his, idea that he was going to run for president of the United States at some point, he was going around to say, look at this budget surplus that California had of $100 billion. Look at the progressive form of government must work. Well, fast forward to today, you all know what California's budget surplus is? It's a little bit of a trick question because they don't have a budget surplus. They have a deficit, and it's over $30 billion budget deficit. And this is one of the reasons why. When you allow your taxpayers to leave, and it's not just individuals. You all saw that little small business by the name of Chevron Corporation leave San Ramon, California after being there for decades and relocate to Texas. They are losing their tax base every single day to other states because they're getting policy wrong. And you look at the other states on the equation, New York, Illinois, New Jersey, Massachusetts. These are America's high tax states that continue to lose each and every year. Now, let's talk the politics of it for just a minute, because we talked the economics. This is where it gets real to members of Congress that some of them only pay attention to what happens in the states every decade or so when state legislators redraw congressional lines. So, California on track. If current projections continue, they will lose 3 new U.S. House districts, will leave California and go to one of the other 49 states. And for those of you in this audience, that's probably a good thing there's not another Nancy Pelosi or AOC roaming the halls of Congress from a state like California. New York, of course, not far behind. Unfortunately, the rubber hits the road for Pennsylvania here, that if current trends continue and if you don't fix the outmigration problem, Pennsylvania will lose another member of the U.S. House delegation. Now, on the flip side, Texas and Florida set to gain 4 congressional seats each in the next census if patterns continue. So this is where it gets real in Washington, D.C. Now, let me just fast forward to the region here, and then I'll invite my friend Dave Taylor to come up, and we're going to continue the conversation. I know the governor here, he's fond of saying, and I tend to agree with him on this point, I hate to lose to Ohio, right? You know, this is a common theme of his. As a Michigan native, I hate to lose to Ohio too, especially in football season. That being said, there's a lot of things that are going to happen if Pennsylvania doesn't change course as soon as possible. You are going to continue, not only just continue to lose to Ohio, Ohio's going to eat our lunch in the Midwest if we're not careful. I was in Columbus last week. I spent a little time down in Marietta in the Marcellus Shale Play. I've seen what they're doing to encourage affordable, reliable American energy in Ohio versus what Pennsylvania's been fiddling with, the RGGI issue and the regional greenhouse gas and the carbon tax and all these cap and trade ideas that are inhibiting oil and gas production in Pennsylvania. And then if you've seen, he's announced publicly now, Vivek Ramaswamy, the co-chair of DOGE with Elon Musk. Vivek is now going to be probably the next governor of Ohio, if you had to read the political tea leaves. He has not only said that he wants to take Ohio from where they're at today, which are already beating Pennsylvania, as you can see in the region here. Vivek has said he wants to, by the time he's done as governor, eliminate the Ohio personal income tax. And even if he doesn't, their budget that they're debating right now is going to a flat tax in Ohio under 3%. So they're going to undercut Pennsylvania's only advantage over Ohio today, and that's the personal income tax. Now, there's a lot of other things to unpack there when it comes to what West Virginia's done. Just incredible movement. Anybody here like the idea of education, freedom, and parental empowerment? Hopefully a few people in this crowd. That, to me, is the civil rights issue of our day, is of empowering parents. And if there's one thing we can all agree upon, hopefully Republican, Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Vegetarian, I don't care what kind of partisan background you come from today, if there's one thing we'd agree upon is we should never, ever allow big government bureaucrats to come in and lock down our communities, our places of business, our churches, and ultimately our children because of some virus or whatever they're talking about. That should never be done again in the United States. And one of the things that was such a magic moment that began to change the course of policy across the United States was when the head of the teachers union, Randy Weingarten, came into Virginia, into Northern Virginia, next to where I am, and basically, along with the left-wing candidate for governor at the time, was campaigning and said, parents should not be involved in their kids' education, determining their outcomes. That's why we have Governor Glenn Youngkin politically, but more importantly now, we have 15 states across America that have universal education freedom and are empowering parents to make those decisions for their own children. That, to me, is an incredible, incredible victory. And two of your states that you're competing with the most, West Virginia and Ohio, have passed policies like that. Our ALEC National Board Chair this year, Senator Patricia Rucker, began this revolution with the Hope Scholarship Act in West Virginia. She's personally an immigrant from Venezuela, an incredible state senator from Jefferson County. It wouldn't have happened without leadership, and it also wouldn't have happened without the other side overreaching on this topic. But let's say the one thing of all the tax things, of all the energy policy pieces that we've seen move in the right direction, perhaps in the 20 years that I've done this, the most that I'm excited about the states taking the lead and moving the ball forward is this idea of putting parents back in charge of their own children's education. And guess what? Just a couple of weeks ago, I was up at the White House. I had lunch with President Trump and several governors. And in case anybody's keeping score at home, Governor Shapiro was not invited to be a part of the lunch. But I'll say this, the president believes so strongly in this idea of parental empowerment, the fact that he is willing to shut down an entire federal government agency. The Department of Education needs to go, ladies and gentlemen. It has never educated a single child in 45 years of existence. And when you look at the NAEP scores across the United States, that 70% of American eighth graders cannot do math or read at grade level. And in Pennsylvania, I'm told it's about 50% at grade level are achieving it. That is a catastrophe of going on across the United States. And until we fix that, it's going to be very difficult to turn economics around. But as I invite Dave Taylor back up to the stage here, let me just leave you with this. Pennsylvania has an amazing opportunity. You've got so many great advantages as a state. Now's the time to learn from the best, avoid the traps of the worst, and with some smart people running policy here in the Commonwealth and empowering families and parents to make those decisions for their own households, it can and it will be done. Thank you very much.
All right, Jonathan, thanks very much. And that was a snootful. But I want to focus on a couple of points that you already raised and just try to elaborate on them a little bit. That you can fall behind by standing still. Can you just, what does that mean?
It's the environment that we face today that states all across the country, whether you like it or not, you're competing against all other 49 states. And especially when you're in a region as Pennsylvania, so let's think about it and unpack the region just briefly here. If you want to feel good about yourselves, compare yourselves to New Jersey or Illinois and New York, right? And ultimately, you feel good about yourselves. Misery loves company, though, right? And that's not the right benchmark. If you want to be a state that's going to be an outbound migration state, losing hundreds of thousands of population, losing your business base, go ahead and compare yourself there and be happy about it. I don't think anybody in this audience is satisfied with that. What you need to be doing is benchmarking yourself against, unfortunately, Ohio, Indiana, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, the growth states across the country. And the vast majority of states are doing that. There's, probably the dyed-in-the-wool 5 or 10 states that want to follow the AOC, Bernie Sanders view of the economy, which is, if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. That is, as Ronald Reagan said, the liberal view of the economy. That is a small subset of states. And folks, if you want to be a growth state, there are 25 or 30 or 35 states that are in that mentality that they know they need to reduce the cost of living and improve the quality of living to attract individuals and businesses to their state. That's the key. And if you don't do that, you are absolutely falling behind by standing still, because states are moving very quickly in that direction.
And I also wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit. So we talked about, people voting with their feet. That folks are going to go where job opportunities are more plentiful and more promising. And so this is why you see people moving from low-performing economic states to the higher-performing economic states. There's a corollary to that I'd like to ask you to comment on, which is also, in a free country with a free economy, that private sector investment choices are voluntary. And so, again, we need the mindset of our lawmakers we need them to be thinking dynamically. We need them to benchmark PA against the high-performing states, but we also need them to be mindful of the opportunity costs of failing to be competitive, because there's, the General Assembly can't pass a law requiring businesses to invest, operate, and hire here in the Commonwealth rather than someplace else.
That's right. I mean, there's no such thing. California would love it if they could find out a way to keep people in by building walls around their state lines, but it doesn't work that way in this system of federalism we have. And that's such an important point. We know, based on survey data, why is it that people go from state to state? Yeah, sometimes it's great to escape cold weather in the winter and other things like that. But people, the number one reason why people go from state to state, economic opportunity. They go for jobs. So to your point about private investment, it's so key to get it right on the side of why is it not just that individuals are going, but why is it that employers decide to relocate? This thing, decisions like Chevron, a huge, huge problem for California, that they're not only losing population, but they're losing the job creators that will be the folks that will bring in population in the future. One other point on that, just briefly, is 2 turnaround stories. I didn't unpack it fully a second ago, but Ohio and West Virginia are 2 incredible population turnaround stories. So the last 40 years, up until just recently, every year for 40 years straight, Ohio had lost population to one of the other 49 states. They just turned it around in the same time frame that they enacted education freedom and tax relief that put Ohio on a competitive path forward. And then West Virginia, I mean, you have to go back as far as statistics reliably are there in terms of the U.S. Census. You have to go back 100 years, and each and every year for a century. Think about that for a second. 100 years, every year, West Virginia lost population to one of the other 49 states until last year. West Virginia gained about 5,000 residents on net after enacting education freedom and tax relief and regulatory relief. That is the magic combo to turn things around. A lot of you might be thinking, hey, we got a lot of work ahead. It's going to be very difficult to turn things around in Pennsylvania. It's not that difficult to turn things around in Pennsylvania. If it can be done in places like Ohio and West Virginia, it absolutely can be done in Pennsylvania.
One of the challenges for us is our fiscal position, our solvency, and that we have seen, Governor Shapiro put the pedal to the metal on increasing spending to the point where even just having a budget at last year's spend level is not sustainable. We are, in terms of our economic performance looking backwards, your report has Pennsylvania at 46. Can you just talk about the importance of fiscal discipline, like that Tabor slide that you showed, that yes, it would be great for individual Pennsylvanians if the government spending had been limited. Can you relate that to overall economic performance?
Yeah, it's a great point. It's impossible to separate that spending discipline from overall economic health and performance. And blowing through the surplus as this current governor has, to then even want to tap into the rainy day fund, even as the economy broadly up until recently had been very, very strong, is absolutely fiscal malpractice. There's no doubt about that. You need some institutional pieces like Tabor that say, let's not go above our means. And that's going to be the key element of things. I mean, it's tough. I mean, it's easy for us to talk about. It's tough to execute from a policymaker's perspective. I see my good friend Barb Gleim, a good ALEC leader, chair of our education task force here in the audience. People like that, if we had more Barb Gleims out there, I think we would have this problem solved. That's the trick of it, right? I mean, you can give Barb a round of applause. A great freedom-loving legislator. One of my economic heroes, Thomas Sowell. Anybody love Thomas Sowell out at Hoover at Stanford, right? He puts his thumb on this problem better than anybody else, I think, the way that he puts it. And that is, the first law of economics is what? A scarcity of resources, right? However, the first law of politics is generally to ignore the first law of economics. And this is a political problem, right? We have to have the right leaders with courage that will take on the swamp, whether that's a DC swamp like Elon is doing. And that's why people don't take on the swamp, because the swamp likes to fight back. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Every state has a state swamp as well. We all know that in Harrisburg and other state capitals. The dollar signs might be smaller and the dollar amounts lower, but every state needs to take on that issue. That is the fundamental issue. If we're going to get it right on the economy, we have to get it right on the spending side.
And Jonathan, I wanted you to please elaborate a little bit. We talk about taxes, and when we say that, we're usually referring to tax rates. Tax rates is a totally different creature than tax receipts, tax collections, and that we want to see tax collections increase because, and only because, the economy is expanding. Can you elaborate on that point, please?
Well, it's a good one. My co-author, Arthur Laffer, if he was here, the legend had it as on a napkin, he wrote out this idea that would become the Laffer curve in economics. And that is, there is sometimes a paradox that people don't think through. They automatically, the folks that do revenue scoring, both in Pennsylvania and certainly at the federal level, they assume that if you raise tax rates, you're automatically going to see tax revenue go up to the proportion that you raise tax rates. Of course, we know this to be absolutely economic folly. It's absolutely the case. If you were to go, and in fact, this has been done, you go to the Congressional Budget Office, which is in the middle of forecasting all kinds of things when it comes to the economy and taxes right now in Washington. And there was a proposal one time to say, let's have a 100% tax rate on individuals and go ahead and give me the score on that. And they came back to say, this is going to raise trillions of dollars of new revenue for the federal government. Anybody that was worth their salt, any economist that's worth their salt knows that that's absolutely insane. It's not going to happen. The idea is, of course, that as taxes are incentives or disincentives in the case, they change people's behavior. They change business investment decisions. They change individuals' decisions in the marketplace. And when that happens, we have this supply side or dynamic effect to tax policy that oftentimes when tax rates go up, tax revenues don't go up or sometimes even go down, as California is realizing the hard way. And you see the boom and bust cycle that states like California go through when they raise taxes, especially on the millionaires and the billionaires. We hear that from Bernie Sanders' crowd all the time. But guess what? Those are small businesses that oftentimes pay those taxes, and they can be very volatile ways to raise revenue. So that's essentially the problem. The way that big government and the swamp thinks about this is you raise tax rates and you get all this extra revenue. In reality, common sense economics, we know that's absolutely not the case.
And I think a key factor in that is the failure to recognize working capital. That, especially for a small business owner, you may have earnings over expenses. That doesn't make it profit. That's the money that you have available for for future investments in your company, for for additional hiring, and so on and so forth. So yes, we need our lawmakers, decision makers to think dynamically, to have an eye on the big picture of how other states are performing and the policies that they have enacted or failed to enact that then affect the overall economy of that competitor state. Pennsylvania has some really tremendous inherent advantages. We have a spectacular geographic location that gives us tremendous access to market. We have we have amazing institutions of higher learning. We have mature institutions of finance. That we have pretty good infrastructure. More needs to be done, but what we have in place works. We also have a tremendous energy opportunity. And while we have realized that to some degree, that there's so much more, it's almost unimaginable how much more potential there is in Pennsylvania's energy opportunity. Can you talk about the energy producing states, North Dakota, West Virginia, Ohio, what they have done and how their performance has changed over time?
It's a great question, and it's something that I learned. We've talked about this a lot over the years, David. As I mentioned, I was down in Ohio last week, and what I learned was when you combine Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, you put those three states together, in terms of natural gas anyways, compared to the rest of the world, if they were a country, these three states, you'd be the third largest natural gas producer in the entire world. I mean, the amount of energy that is sitting here that's reliable, affordable, and clean energy, by the way, that's American produced, is something that those three states could use to be the economic powerhouses of the next 50 years in the country. I'm convinced of that. We've seen it in North Dakota reinvent themselves. We've seen Texas obviously utilize that to great effect. What they do, though, and what Pennsylvania has not done yet, and some of these other states have, is you combine that inherent advantage that God has blessed you with here with the Marcellus Shale and other plays here across the Commonwealth. You combine that with good policy in other areas, such as Texas avoiding the income tax, or Ohio becoming much more competitive in other areas, and West Virginia with school choice, and all these things that have been done. You combine those factors together, and I think that's really what's going to make the difference going forward.
And that to me, that really is the most important point. A lot of times, the question is posed, well, what's the one thing that we need to do? Well, I wish it was just one thing. If I have to choose one, I say spending restraint is the most important one, but that's not a silver bullet. At the same time that you have to do, regulatory reform, limits on lawsuit abuse, business tax relief, a pro-production, pro-deployment agenda for energy. It's only when all of those positive changes are implemented that you'll get the cumulative effect of a really robust, dynamic economy at the state level that will generate prosperity, and with it, the wealth creation, the job opportunities, and the population growth that will go along with that when those opportunities exist for people.
Well, that's right. And the other thing is, I would suggest that now doing this for a long time and seeing so many states rise and fall, I think it's really important not to be an outlier in the wrong ways. Yeah. And Pennsylvania is an outlier in the wrong ways in a couple of issues. And now that we've had 25 states dramatically cut taxes in the last 4 sessions, 15 states become universal school choice states in the last 4 or 5 sessions. And then the idea that Pennsylvania still has a death tax on the books when only about 5 states in the entire country has a death tax. Go ahead. It's time to be repealed, the death tax. There's absolutely no reason why states should be raising it. It doesn't raise any money, get back to your earlier point, because you lose many of those retirees going for warmer weather or other reasons otherwise, and that's just one more reason to leave the Commonwealth. There are things like that on Pennsylvania's resume that make absolutely no sense whatsoever.
So, Jonathan, give us an overall picture nationwide. Do you see an overall dynamic, and does that dynamic make you hopeful for the nation's future?
Well, up until recently, there's a big question mark there, right? I mean, 36 trillion reasons to be pessimistic, I think, about the future. However, with President Trump again in the White House, with DOGE, with so many of these things looking to not have centralized government control, but to empower states and empower people is the key message, I think, coming out of this administration in the first few months, whether that's Department of Education or other things being shifted away from Washington, D.C., I'm becoming more optimistic. There's some big challenges ahead. Obviously, geopolitical challenges, some of the greatest in our lifetimes, are probably greater than any that we've seen in our lifetimes in many cases. And when we look at the trajectory of debt, we have to really worry about that. In fact, many of you know this, but it took from America's founding in 1776 to roughly 1980 for us to accumulate the first $1 trillion of national debt. Think about that. It took over 200 years as a country to be $1 trillion indebted. Now we're 36 trillion. We've got to get a handle on that situation. But I do think that the mentality in Washington makes a big difference. At the top, the leadership, when you have someone at 1600 Pennsylvania, when you have people like Speaker Mike Johnson, a great ALEC alum, by the way, who's fighting his darndest to keep them and rowing and herding the cats, as we like to say in Washington, D.C., and trying to keep everybody in the right direction in the House, and Leader Thune, we've got to get the tax cuts renewed. I mean, if we think the 401ks look bad after the last couple of days, you don't want to think about what a future without the tax cuts being renewed and us going backwards as a country on a huge tax increase on top of that. But if we can get that done, if we can let Elon and the DOGE folks do their work and begin to unravel this huge national debt issue, and then we allow states to lead, I'm very optimistic about this future because we have somebody. It's so rare in Washington that people are there that want to give up power voluntarily. And when I was sitting there with the president and those few governors for 2 hours, the thing that came across time and time again was, I want to empower parents and states to do the right thing. And one of the biggest challenges we face, and this is not just a challenge of policy, this is a national security challenge. If we have 70% of our eighth graders that can't do math and reading at grade level, that's a national security challenge. If we fix that and fix the economy, I'm very excited about where we're going as a country.
It's heartening to hear that, and also at the same time, the opportunity of the feds, letting go means that it's even more critical for good policy making at the state level so that we can, make the most of those opportunities.
To summarize 20 years of rich states, poor states into one sentence, it's be more like Texas and Florida and less like Illinois, California, and New York. And that's what we need. We need more states like the growth states. I just looked at the numbers the other day. Utah, the #1 ranked state in rich states, poor states, for all 17 editions of our report. Utah had more than 4% GDP growth over the last period that was suggested. We're being told nationally for now the longest time, Janet Yellen and the Biden administration said we need to be content at 1.5% or 2% GDP growth. Folks, that's not going to get it done. We need to revive the American economy like we saw during the first Trump administration after the tax cuts and deregulation that we're seeing being talked about again in Washington. And we need to get to a 3 or 4% GDP growth as a country. How do you do that? We look to the states. That is exactly why the founders put these 50 laboratories of democracy in motion, that Washington can stop the mistakes and not repeat the mistakes of New York and Illinois and California. They can double down on those successes instead.
Ladies and gentlemen, you understand why we appreciate our friend Jonathan Williams so much. Please join me in thanking Jonathan. Very, very much.